Colette Avery was 71 years old when her stepson looked at her across the attorney's conference table and said with the voice of a man discarding a paper napkin, "You get the cabin. That place up in the mountains Dad drove to once a month. Middle of nowhere. Seems fair." Fair. The word landed in the air-conditioned stillness of the Savannah law office like a stone dropped into a deep well. Colette felt the impact. She made no sound. 46 years. 46 years of waking before dawn, cooking, washing, mending, waiting, yielding, loving, building. And what remained for her was what nobody else wanted. If you're here for the first time, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because every story on this channel is about women like Colette. Women the world underestimated and life surprised. Stay until the end, because what she found inside that cabin will make you believe that justice may arrive late, but it never loses the address. Across the table, Hollis Nolan and Rosalind. The three children Warren Avery had brought from a previous marriage had done the arithmetic before the casket was cold. The townhouse on Gaston Street appraised at one point, $7 million would go to the three of them in equal shares. The investments, $138,000 in bonds and CDs, divided the same way. The silver Buick Enclave Warren drove on Sundays would be Rosalind's, because Rosalind always needed a better car. For the woman who had lived beside the man for nearly half a century, there remained a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina that they themselves described with curled lips. A shack with a tin roof, mice in the crawl space, gravel road you can't find on GPS. Their father drove up there once a month, and nobody ever understood why. "Watch out for the copperheads," Nolan said, and the three of them walked out laughing while the paralegal pretended not to hear. Colette sat alone in the leather chair for more than 3 minutes after everyone left. She looked at her hands, palms flat on the mahogany. Hands that had carried children who were not hers. Hands that had prepared Thanksgiving dinners that were never thanked for. Hands that had changed bandages and packed suitcases and wiped fevered foreheads. Hands that Warren held every night before sleep, saying always the same thing in a low voice. "You know, I love you in a way most people will never love anyone, right, Colette?" She had known for 46 years that it was true. What she did not know, what no one in that family could have imagined, was that Warren had spent 30 years building proof. And that proof was locked in a stone cellar beneath a house in the Blue Ridge Mountains, waiting for a key that was waiting for her. Colette Marguerite Doss, whom everyone had called Colette since girlhood, because the full name was too long for the simple people she loved, was born on a March morning in 1951 in a clapboard house on the outskirts of Ellijay, Georgia, a small town in the southern Appalachian foothills where the apple orchards climbed every available slope and the women learned before they learned to read that to exist was above all to serve. Her father, Virgil Doss, was a copper miner at the Copper Hill operation across the Tennessee line. He did not have much beyond the honor he carried in his name and an extraordinary capacity to work from pre-dawn to dusk without complaint. Her mother, Luetta, was a small and resilient woman who could make a pot of pinto beans stretch further than seemed possible and who had the habit of singing softly while she swept the porch. Always the same song, an old shape note hymn her grandmother had taught her, whose words Colette never fully understood, but whose melody she carried inside her chest for the rest of her life. There were 6 children. Colette was the third right in the middle, which meant she was never first or last in anything. Not the youngest who needed holding, not the eldest who carried responsibility. She was the middle one, the one who learned to manage, to not complain, to find space where there was no space. This quality, which might have looked like invisibility, was in truth a silent form of strength that Colette would carry for the rest of her life without naming it. The childhood in Ellijay was cold mornings and the smell of wet clay of a public school with wooden desks where the teacher, Miss Hattie, taught multiplication by clapping hands, and where Colette discovered she loved reading with an intensity that surprised her parents. Virgil could barely read. He signed his name with difficulty until the day he died. But he bought Colette when he could. The used paperbacks that showed up at the monthly flea market wrapped in newspapers smelling of mildew and story. She read everything: novels by Willa Cather Flannery O'Connor, collections, cookbook manuals, medicine labels, cereal boxes. She read the way a person drinks water when they are thirsty. At 13, Colette began working at the home of Mrs. Yancey, the widow of the county judge, helping with the kitchen and cleaning 3 times a week in exchange for a small sum she handed entirely to her mother. There was no sadness in this arrangement. It was what one did. It was what girls from simple families did. And Colette did it well and without bitterness. Mrs. Yancey treated her with respect and sometimes lent her books from the late judge's shelves, which for Colette compensated for anything. It was on one of those afternoons at Mrs. Yancey's house that she met Warren. He was 26 and passing through Elijah on business. An architect recently graduated from Georgia Tech, hired by an Atlanta firm to survey a parcel of land nearby. He was tall, thin, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had dark hair parted to the side with that slightly awkward posture of someone who had spent more years among blueprints and drafting tables than among people. Mrs. Yancey was a distant aunt of a colleague of Warren's and had offered a room and dinner while he stayed in the area. Colette was setting the table when he arrived. She was 19 and wearing a blue cotton dress washed so many times the color had faded closer to gray. She paid no special attention to the young man who walked through the door with a worn leather portfolio under his arm. It was Warren who stopped. Years later, many years later, he would tell the story this way. I walked into the dining room and you had your back to me arranging the centerpiece. When you turned around, I thought that is the face I want to see every day for the rest of my life. I can't explain it any better than that. Colette always laughed when he told this version. You were hungry and I was the one about to serve dinner. Don't romanticize it, Warren. But she also knew she had felt something, a different kind of attention, a gaze that lingered longer than necessary, a conversation at dinner about Flannery O'Connor's stories that no one in Elijah would have been equipped to hold, and that Warren conducted with genuine enthusiasm when he discovered she had read the same titles. You've read Everything That Rises Must Converge, he asked with his mouth still half full of cornbread, and the surprise in his voice was real. Twice, she said. And something settled between them in that moment that had no name but that they both recognized. Warren stayed 10 days in Elijah. 10 days of conversations on the porch after dinner, of short walks around the town square, where the Confederate Memorial still had its original bronze patina from 1912 of books lent and opinions exchanged about them. On the morning of the 11th day, when the company truck came for him, Warren asked for Colette's address with a formality that made her smile and promised to write. He wrote. He wrote every week for 9 months long letters on the firm's stationery that arrived at the Elijah post office, smelling of fresh ink which Colette folded in 4 and kept inside one of Mrs. Yancey's books. A volume of O'Connor's collected stories, ironically, that had been given to her as a parting gift. Colette responded with the same regularity on plain paper bought at the general store. She later discovered that Warren kept her letters inside a shoebox that sat on his office desk for 40 years. In the 10th month, Warren drove to Elijah in person to formally ask Virgil for permission to court Colette. Virgil received him in the front room with his eldest son beside him, and the gravity of a man who knows this moment matters. Warren wore a suit. He was not entirely comfortable in the suit, but he was there. Virgil asked the questions that needed asking. Warren answered without looking away. Permission was granted with a firm handshake, and Virgil's simple, absolute counsel. She's a good woman, treat her right. Warren did. For 46 years he did. The wedding took place in April of 1975 at the Methodist Church in Elijah, with the pews full of townsfolk and a cake made by Luetta herself, 3 tiers with paper dogwood blossoms on top. Colette wore the white dress Luetta had sewn over 3 weeks with lace at the sleeves from a dress of her grandmother's that had been stored in a cedar chest for decades. Warren, seeing her at the church entrance, removed his glasses, wiped the lenses with his pocket handkerchief, and put them back on, as if he needed to make sure he was seeing correctly. Then he whispered so quietly that no one but she could hear, "My God, Colette." She laughed. She laughed through much of the ceremony in a way the pastor found unusual, but the guests found contagious. What did not appear in the celebration, what the first days of marriage revealed, was that Warren came to the union carrying a complicated history. He had been married before from 21 to 25 to a woman named Sandra from a well-connected Atlanta family, and who, according to the polite version, simply did not work out. The less polite version, which Warren told Colette during their second week of marriage because he believed she deserved to know, was that Sandra had left 3 children. Hollis, age 6, Nolan, age 4, Rosalind, age 2, when she decided married life was not what she wanted, and departed for California with a session musician without leaving a forwarding address. Warren had been alone with 3 small children without any real support network, trying to balance his work as an architect with raising them, and had spent 2 years in a state of exhaustion and quiet desperation that he described without shame but without drama. Colette heard all of this on a rainy night, sitting on the bed of the rented apartment that would be their first home together. She said only, "Where are they now?" Hollis, Nolan, and Rosalind were in a boarding arrangement in Atlanta in the care of an aunt of Warren's, who had taken on the task willingly, but who made clear in every phone call that the situation was temporary. Colette made the decision that same night. Bring them home. It's not right, those children staying with someone who doesn't want them. Warren looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what you're saying? There are 3 of them. The youngest is 2. "I can count, Warren." And there was in that response a firmness that closed the conversation. The children arrived in May of 1975, 3 weeks after the wedding. Hollis was 7, suspicious and quiet. Nolan was 5, restless and difficult. Rosalind was 3 and cried at night, calling for a mother who was no longer there. Colette received them with clean rooms, pressed sheets, warm food, and a patience that was not performance. It was genuine. It was hers. It was the way Luetta had raised her without ever naming this virtue. She never formally adopted the 3 because Sandra never signed the necessary papers, and Warren could never locate her. But in practice, in the daily life of things, Colette was the only mother those children had from that point forward. Who took them to the doctor when they were sick? Who went to parent-teacher conferences? Who stayed awake when they had fevers? Who taught Rosalind to read? Who helped Nolan with his multiplication tables? Who sat with Hollis when the quiet boy started having nightmares and didn't know how to say so? She never expected gratitude. She did not do it for gratitude. She did it because they were children who needed someone. She was a responsible adult, and that was sufficient for her. The years that followed were years of slow construction. Warren worked hard, a competent and meticulous architect who rose in his firm through merit and discipline. Colette managed the home and the children with the same precision Warren brought to his blueprints. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Savannah's Victorian district, then moved to a larger place on Habersham Street when Warren received his first promotion. Then came the townhouse on Gaston Street, grander still, which would be the family home for more than 20 years. Colette did not work outside the home during those years. Not for lack of ability or desire, but because with 3 children who were not hers biologically, and a husband who traveled for work frequently, there was simply no way. She was the one who held everything together. And she held it with competence, with affection, with a domestic organization that made the house run like a clock. The clothes always pressed, the pantry always stocked, the birthdays always remembered, the school dates always on the calendar. Warren came home from long trips, and the house was clean, and the food was ready, and the children had done their homework. And Colette was in the kitchen humming softly that melody her mother used to sing while sweeping the porch. He recognized what she did. This mattered. Warren never treated Colette's work as invisible or lesser. He told friends at firm dinners where such things were said that without his wife at home, he would never have gotten where he got. And he said it with a conviction that was not social protocol. It was truth he believed. He brought flowers for no special reason, left notes in the kitchen, remembered the day they met with a precision of dates that embarrassed Colette, who sometimes confused whether it had been a Thursday or a Friday. There was, however, one thing Warren did that Colette could never fully understand, no matter how she tried. Once a month, almost without fail, Warren took the car on a Friday afternoon and returned Sunday evening. He said he was going to the cabin to take care of some things. You know how it is, Colette. Colette did not know how it was, but she learned early that asking produced no satisfying answers. Warren was not evasive out of malice. He was evasive the same way he was private about everything that concerned his interior life, the projects in his head, the worries he processed in silence. He was like that. And Colette, who loved him as she loved him, learned to respect that space without understanding it. The cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 14 acres of forested land in a remote hollow east of Brevard, North Carolina, had been purchased by Warren in 1989, when the couple had been married 14 years, and the stepchildren were already teenagers. He announced the purchase on a Saturday afternoon with a nonchalance that was almost disorienting, the way someone might mention buying a new pair of shoes. Bought a piece of land with a stone cottage up in the Blue Ridge. Needed a place to think. Colette accepted this because that was how Warren functioned. He made decisions alone and then communicated them not out of disregard for the relationship, but because there were certain things he needed to work through at his own pace before opening them to the world. She never went to the cabin during all those years, not because Warren forbade it. Warren never forbade anything, but because he never invited her in a way that sounded like a real invitation. And Colette had enough pride not to go where she was not clearly welcome. She asked once early on if she could come along. Warren went quiet for a moment and said, "Not yet, Colette. It's not ready yet." She asked what wasn't ready. He smiled in that way that was only his, a way that involved the corners of his eyes before his mouth, and said, "You'll understand when the time comes." Colette waited. The time never seemed to come. The stepchildren grew. Hollis graduated from law school at Mercer and opened a practice in Savannah. Nolan went into real estate development, always with more money than transparency about where it came from. Rosalind married, young, divorced, married again, divorced again, and lived in a condo that Warren had helped purchase on an occasion Colette only learned about after the fact. The three maintained with their father a relationship of functional cordiality, not deep love, but reasonable convenience. With Colette, the relationship was cooler. There was no open hostility, not most of the time, but there was a distance that none of the three ever showed any desire to close. She was Dad's wife. She was not their mother. Never was in their perception. Colette knew this early and accepted it not because she agreed, but because there was nothing to do beyond continuing to be who she was, present, caring, available, and hoping that time would teach what words could not. There were beautiful Christmases. This needed to be said. There was one Christmas in particular in 1999, when all three stepchildren had come home with their respective spouses and two small grandchildren, and the table was set for 12 with the embroidered cloth Luetta had given as a wedding present. And Warren had put on the turntable, they still had the turntable, a Patsy Cline record that played softly all afternoon while they ate and talked and laughed about old things. Colette remembered standing in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the living room full of people who were the family she had helped build, and feeling a happiness so complete it hurt a little. The kind of happiness that already comes with the awareness that it will not last forever. Warren retired in 2011 at 62 with a reception the firm held at the DeSoto Hotel, where he spoke for nearly 20 minutes, thanking colleagues by name with the precision of memory that was his trademark. In the audience, Colette applauded with her hands at chest height in the contained way that was hers, and there were tears she did not try to hide. Warren's health began to show signs in 2018. Small things at first, a tiredness that would not pass, a shortness of breath climbing stairs. The diagnosis came in March of 2019, ischemic cardiomyopathy with significant compromise. Treatable but serious. The cardiologist was honest. With proper treatment and lifestyle changes, years of quality were possible. Without them, not. Warren treated. And during the 3 years that followed, he continued going to the cabin once a month with a regularity that increased rather than decreased. Colette noticed the effort he made not to miss a single trip, and sat with the question she could never answer. What was in that place that was more important than resting, than preserving his health, than staying close to the person who loved him? Not yet, he said one last time in September of 2021, when she asked again if she could come. There was something different in his voice, not evasion, but contained urgency, the urgency of a man who is running out of time and knows it. Warren Avery died on a Sunday evening in November of 2021, sitting in his armchair in the living room, with a book open in his lap and the turntable playing softly. He was 75. Colette was in the kitchen making tea when she heard the book fall to the floor. The tea never finished steeping. The week after the funeral was the week the stepchildren began showing who they were, in a way Colette could no longer ignore. Hollis returned on Monday with a folder of documents and a name, Chandler and Polk attorneys, and asked Colette to sign several things related to the estate. Colette said she would prefer to wait, that she wanted her own attorney to review the papers first. Hollis said it was standard procedure, that there was nothing unusual, that he was trying to expedite matters for everyone's benefit. Colette said she would wait regardless. Hollis left with the folder closed and an expression she had only seen on him as a child when he did not get what he wanted. On Tuesday, Nolan called, asked if Colette had located the deed for the cabin, that property up in North Carolina, you know. Colette said she had not. Nolan said he was asking because perhaps it was a property that could be more useful sold right to simplify the estate. Colette said she had not found anything, and hung up without the feeling that she had fully understood what had just happened. On Wednesday, Rosalind appeared with her younger daughter and spent the afternoon in the living room with Colette, drinking coffee and talking about Warren with an affection that Colette received with relief. It was good to speak about him. It was good to remember. At the end of the afternoon, on her way out, Rosalind said in passing, with the lightness of someone mentioning the weather, "Colette, this townhouse is awfully big for one person, isn't it? Have you thought that maybe a smaller place might be more comfortable for you?" Colette stood with the coffee cup in her hand, staring at the closed door for a long time after Rosalind left. The reading of the will happened on a December morning, grey and cold. Hollis, Nolan and Rosalind arrived with their attorneys, which said a great deal about the state of things. Colette arrived with Margot Kellner, whom a neighbor had recommended, a woman of 52 with an office on Bull Street and a directness Colette found comforting. The notary read the document aloud with the neutral intonation of someone who has seen everything. When the passage about the unanimity clause was read, requiring all three siblings to agree unanimously on any decision regarding the townhouse, the investments, any sale, rental, or renovation, Hollis and Nolan looked at each other. It was a quick look, but Colette caught it. There was something in it she could not name at the time, but later identified as the exact expression of two men who have just realized they have been locked inside their own trap. Because they despised each other. Everyone knew they despised each other. There had been a feud for years over a commercial lot in Pooler that Nolan claimed Hollis had sold without authorization, and Hollis claimed he had verbal permission, and no one had witnesses for anything. They would never agree on anything regarding the townhouse they had just inherited together. The will left Colette the cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains with all belongings therein, and the phrase that stopped the room: "Anything the property may contain that is not visible to the naked eye." That last clause hung in the conference room, like a note that refuses to fade. Outside the attorney's office afterward, on the sidewalk with the low December sky pressing down on Savannah's live oaks, Hollis approached Colette. There was in his posture the tense restraint of a man controlling something that wants to explode. You understand that cabin is worth nothing, right? It's a stone shack with a tin roof. Dad went up there to fish and sleep. Nothing special about it. Good luck with the back taxes. Hollis, Colette said. What? Nothing. I was just saying your name. He did not know what to do with that, and he left. Nolan did not approach, but he said something to his attorney in a low voice, which the attorney later, by carelessness or design, repeated close enough for Colette to hear. Tell her if she wants to sell, we'll buy it for $50,000 and take the burden off her hands. $50,000. Less than half the appraisal their own preliminary filing had estimated. That night alone in the townhouse that was already being measured by cordiality, Colette went to Warren's study, the one room where he had always asked that no one rearrange things. Not for secrecy, he said, but for order, because he was the kind of man who lost his thread when someone moved the position of things. She noticed for the first time consciously that there was a lower drawer that was locked. It had always been there. The small brass lock had never seemed relevant. It seemed relevant now. She searched for the key that night without finding it. She searched the next morning and the morning after that. On the third evening, moving a stack of old architectural journals from the shelf above the desk, she found it not a small brass key, but something else entirely. A brown envelope thick with her name written on the front in Warren's handwriting. Colette. Just that. No address, no stamp, no date. The envelope was sealed. Colette held it in her hands for a long time without opening it. It was nearly midnight. The townhouse was quiet and dark except for the light of the desk lamp, which made a yellow circle around her hands, and the brown envelope. She opened it. Inside were two items. An old iron key with a ring-shaped bow, the kind used in antique locks, tied to a piece of red twine, and a sheet of paper folded in four with a single line written in the center of the page. When you're ready, the key opens the cellar. The cellar has everything. Everything. Colette, forgive the wait. She read the line 3 times. Then she folded the paper, placed it back in the envelope with the key, and sat in the chair of Warren's study until the sky outside began to lighten. The iron key lay in her palm, cold and heavy, shaped like something that had been waiting a very long time to be held. In the morning, while making coffee in the kitchen where the white subway tiles caught the first gray light of a Savannah winter dawn, Colette made the decision. She was going to the cabin. She had $212 in her wallet, a suitcase with winter clothes, 3 books from the shelf, the O'Connor collection Warren had given her on their 2nd anniversary, a Bible that had been Luetta's, and a mystery novel she had started before Warren's death and had not been able to return to, but wanted nearby, and a brown envelope containing an iron key tied with red twine. She did not know what was in the cellar. She did not know what everything meant. She did not know if the cabin had running water or a working furnace, or whether the road was passable in January. But she had the key, and the key had been left for her by the only person who had ever loved her, the way most people will never love anyone. On the morning of her departure, a Sunday in January of 2022, cold and clear, Colette walked through the townhouse one last time. She entered each room with attention, as though she were saying goodbye, or as though she were memorizing. The living room where the turntable sat. The kitchen with the white tiles she had chosen when they renovated in 2001. Warren's study, already partially emptied by the stepchildren who came to collect books and objects with the justification that they were memories of Dad. The bedroom with the bed that was too large for one person, and that had been too large since November. She closed the front door, descended the stairs to the street, and got into the taxi she had called the evening before. On the sidewalk, while the driver placed her suitcase in the trunk, Colette looked up at the facade of the townhouse where she had lived for more than 20 years. The third-floor windows, their rooms, were shuttered. She looked for a moment. "Ma'am, we going?" "We're going," Colette said, and she got into the car. In her coat pocket, wrapped in the brown envelope inside her purse, the iron key pressed against her hip, with the weight of something that was not merely metal, the weight of 30 years of silence and whatever waited on the other side of it. The Greyhound bus pulled out of the Savannah station at 9:15 on a Sunday morning that smelled of thermos coffee diesel exhaust and that particular mixture of sweat and fried food that is universal to every bus terminal in America. Colette had bought her ticket at the counter, $41 to Brevard, North Carolina, with a transfer in Greenville, and sat on the hard plastic seat with her suitcase between her feet and her purse in her lap, the iron key inside the brown envelope pressing against her hip through the leather. There was a woman in her 40s, seated 2 rows ahead with 2 small children, the younger one asleep against her shoulder, the older one eating animal crackers with absolute concentration. The woman's eyes were on her phone, but her arm was stretched across the sleeping child in that automatic reflex, the gesture of a mother, that does not require consciousness to happen. Colette watched her for a long moment, thought of Luetta sweeping the porch humming, thought of Warren with his measuring tape the day they walked through their first apartment, thought of the brown envelope, thought of the line, "Forgive the wait." The landscape began to change as soon as they cleared the coastal plain. The flat marshland gave way to the red clay hills of the Piedmont. The houses grew further apart. The pines grew taller, and the ridgelines of the southern Appalachians appeared on the horizon, with that blue-gray haze that is specific to these mountains, and that Colette had always considered the most beautiful thing in the world, without ever having said so to anyone. She dozed after they passed through. Anderson woke when the bus stopped at a gas station where a man boarded hollering, "Boiled peanuts, biscuits, cold cheerwine." And she bought a cup of black coffee that was hot and bitter in exactly the right way. Through the window, the upstate of South Carolina spread out in green hills and pastures with cattle that looked painted. They were so still. In Greenville, a 40-minute transfer. She ate a lunch at a diner across from the station, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and ate slowly with her eyes on the window. The formica table was cracked at the edges, and the waitress was a girl of maybe 17, who called every customer on with a naturalness that made Colette smile. The second bus, smaller, began climbing as soon as it left the flatland behind. The curves tightened, the vegetation thickened and darkened, and those granite outcroppings that the Blue Ridge has everywhere appeared along the roadside without warning. Great slabs of gray rock furred with lichen, as if someone with a sculptor's eye had placed them deliberately. The air coming through the cracked window grew cooler and cleaner, carrying that smell of damp forest floor after rain. That is one of the few smells in the world that needs no explanation for anyone who has felt it. Colette watched through the window the entire time. For 30 years, Warren had made this journey once a month. 30 years of climbing through these ridges, of seeing these rocks, of breathing this air. She tried to imagine what it was like for him, what he felt arriving, what he thought during the drive, with what eyes he saw this landscape she was seeing for the first time. The image would not form completely the way it never does when you try to imagine the interior of someone you loved, but who kept certain things with great firmness. The bus reached the main street of Brevard at 3:30 in the afternoon. The town was smaller than Colette had imagined. Though she knew it was small, a few thousand people, more village than city, with the main street lined in old brick storefronts and a courthouse with a white clock tower visible from every direction. There were tourists even on this Sunday afternoon, because Brevard is that kind of place, gateway to the Pisgah National Forest waterfalls. In every direction, the sort of town that draws people year-round for reasons they cannot fully articulate but can feel. Colette stood on the sidewalk with a suitcase beside her and the paper with the cabin's address in her hand. She had found the address among the documents Warren kept in his desk, an old deed describing the property as Rural Route 4, Locust Hollow Road, unincorporated, Henderson County. She asked a man passing by if he knew where it was. The man stopped, adjusted his ball cap, looked at the paper. "Locust Hollow," he said. "Yes, ma'am, I know it. About 4 miles out, gravel road. You walking?" "I don't drive," Colette said. The man considered her. He was about 70, lean and weathered, with the unhurried expression of mountain people who assess before they decide. "Hold on," he said, and walked to a pickup truck parked at the curb. Came back with keys in hand. "I'll take you, more or less, on my way. I don't want to trouble you." "No trouble, it's what you do." He said it with a simplicity that was identical to Virgil's, and Colette felt her eyes sting in a way she had not expected. His name was Walt Griggs. He drove Colette up the gravel road that wound away from town past a waterfall the locals called Slick Rock Falls, and through a stretch of hardwood forest where the bare winter branches made a cathedral ceiling above the road. The pickup climbed and dropped through the hollows with the familiarity of a man who knew every rut. Walt talked about the area, the music festival every October, the white squirrels that lived only in Brevard, the old logging roads that crisscrossed the ridgeline. "You know anybody up here?" he asked. "I inherited a cabin," Colette said, "from my husband." Walt was quiet for a moment. "What was his name?" "Warren. Warren Avery." The truck slowed slightly. "Mr. Avery," Walt said slowly, the way a person says a name they have been expecting to hear. "From Locust Hollow." "You knew him?" "Knew him by sight. Came up every month, quiet man, polite. Bought his bread at Dot's store every time." He stopped the truck in front of a wooden gate between two stone pillars, rough-cut granite chest, high with dark green moss growing in the joints. A chain was looped around the gate, but no padlock. "This is it." Colette looked at the gate. Beyond it, a gravel drive flanked by dormant rhododendrons whose bare branches formed a tunnel. At the far end, partially visible through the winter trees, the roofline of a structure. "Good luck, Mimiya," Walt said. He waited with the naturalness of a man who does not leave until he's certain things are all right. Colette got out, took a suitcase, walked to the gate, removed the chain with hands that did not tremble, but wanted to push the weathered wood that opened with a creak that cut the silence of the afternoon. She turned to Walt and gave him a nod of thank you, that said more than words. He returned it, started the engine, and drove away slowly down the gravel road. Colette stood alone at the mouth of the path that led to Warren's house. She breathed the cold mountain air deeply and began to walk. The house revealed itself gradually. First the roof hand-split cedar shakes darkened by decades of weather and lichen, the ridgeline straight and true, built to endure. Not a shake missing, not a sag anywhere. Then the walls as the path curved gently through the trees. Native granite, the gray stone of these mountains, laid in courses with mortar that in some places had been recently repointed. There was a difference in color between the old mortar, nearly charcoal, and the fresh patches, still pale. Someone had maintained these walls. Someone had cared for them not long ago. The house was a single story with a lean-to addition at the rear. Two windows on the front face with wooden frames painted a faded blue that had once been vivid and had aged into something deeper, more honest. The shutters were closed. The front door was heavy chestnut wide with an old mortise lock that matched the iron key in the brown envelope. Below the old lock, a newer deadbolt had been installed, and taped to the door frame a white envelope with the name Colette in Warren's handwriting. Colette stood in front of the door for a moment. The late afternoon light came through the bare branches at a low angle and struck the granite wall so that every fleck of mica in the stone caught fire briefly. She opened the envelope. Inside, a modern key and a note of 3 lines. "The new lock takes this key. The old key is for the cellar. The hatch is in the kitchen floor. Dot, who lives up the road, knows everything. She has been waiting for you. I love you, Colette." The new lock turned without resistance. The chestnut door swung inward, slowly yielding its weight with a smoothness that surprised her. The hinges were freshly oiled. The interior received her with the air of a place closed for some time but not abandoned. The smell was cold stone and dry wood, and beneath everything very faintly the smell of oil paint. The front room had wide plank oak floors, worn smooth but intact. Stone walls unplastered the way old mountain houses were built, walls that looked like the inside of a cave and kept the heat of the day outside with an efficiency no drywall could match. A plank table with 2 chairs. On it a candlestick with white candles that had been used but not to the end. 2 ladder-back chairs against the wall. A hand-loomed rug in the center faded, but clearly handmade with a pattern of diamonds in mountain colors, goldenrod rust forest green. The kitchen was at the rear, separated by a half wall of stone that served as a counter. A 4-burner stove, too new for the house. Warren had bought it recently. A soapstone sink original to the construction, stained by years with the patina that soapstone develops when well used. A window that looked onto the rear of the property, and through it the last light of afternoon, golden and warm, illuminating shelves stocked with provisions, dried beans, rice, salt, sugar, coffee in a tin oil pasta. None of it old. Placed recently. Someone had stocked the kitchen expecting an arrival. And there in the corner of the kitchen floor was what Colette had been looking for since she entered. A wooden hatch with an iron ring pull, the access to the cellar. She looked at the hatch for a long moment. Then she turned her back and went to see the rest of the house first, because she had learned over 71 years that the things that matter most deserve to be approached at the right time, prepared. 2 bedrooms off a short hallway, the first smaller with a single bed and a new mattress still in factory plastic. The second larger with a full-size iron bed frame, painted black mattress, also new in plastic. A solid wood dresser with brass pulls that was empty but smelled of cedar. And on the walls of the second bedroom, 2 things that stopped Colette completely. A mirror in a gilded frame that looked very old and very well kept. And on the opposite wall, a painting. The painting showed a woman in a faded blue-gray dress, seen from behind looking through the window of a room that Colette took 1 second to recognize as the living room of the Gaston Street townhouse with the turntable in the background. The woman's hair was pinned at the nape in that gesture of someone who pinned it carelessly, but got it right. And there was in the posture, the shoulders, the tilt of the head, something so specific and true that Colette felt the air leave her lungs all at once. It was her. It was Colette. 30 years younger in the dress, but unmistakably her. She stood in front of the painting for a long time, hands clasped in front of her body. Then she reached out 1 finger and touched the frame lightly. "Warren," she said softly, and said nothing more. That was when she heard a knock at the front door. The woman on the doorstep was about 65, short and broad, with white hair cut blunt at the jaw, and a kitchen apron over a floral cotton dress that was clearly the uniform of someone who had been in the middle of supper when she decided to come. She carried a covered pot wrapped in a dish towel and had in her eyes the expression of someone who has waited for a moment for a very long time, and now that it has arrived, does not quite know what to do with it. "You're Colette." It was not a question. "I am. I'm Dorothea Suttles. Most people call me Dot. I live up the road 1/4 mile. Mr. Avery asked me to keep an eye on the place years ago." She lifted the pot. "Brought bean soup. Gets cold at night up here, and you must be hungry after that trip." "Come in," Colette said. Dot entered the way someone enters a place they know well, because she did evidently, and went straight to the kitchen with the familiarity of a regular visitor. Set the pot on the stove over low heat, reached into the cabinet above the sink, and took out 2 mugs. Went to the refrigerator, which was running. Colette only noticed now, and inside were eggs, a wedge of cheese butter, a bottle of cold water. "He'd call me every month before he came," Dot said, her back turned busy with the mugs. "Tell me the day he'd arrive, the day he'd leave. Sometimes I brought food, sometimes he didn't need it because he brought his own. After he got sick these last trips, I always brought something because he'd arrived too tired to cook." She paused. "He was a good man, your Mr. Avery." "He was," Colette said. Dot turned. There was something in her eyes that needed to be said, and that was costing her. But she was the kind of woman who says things even when they cost. He talked about you every time, every single time. 30 years coming up here once a month, and every visit there was a story about Colette. Colette did this. Colette said that Colette read this book. She set the mugs on the table. We've been waiting for you a long time. Colette sat in the ladder-back chair. Dot sat in the other. They were quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable. "The cellar," Colette said. "You know what's down there." "I do." "How long have you known?" "About 10 years. One day he called me over and showed me. Said he needed a witness that it was there, that it was real." She looked at her hands. "He asked me to keep it to myself, and I kept it to myself." After the bean soup thick seasoned with bay leaf warming Colette from the inside out, the way only food made with intention can, Dot left with the promise of returning in the morning. And Colette was alone in the stone house with the sound of wind in the bare trees outside and the hatch in the kitchen floor waiting. She washed the mugs, unpacked the suitcase, made the bed with the sheets she found folded in the bedroom closet, white-pressed smelling of bar soap. And then she returned to the kitchen, knelt on the stone floor beside the hatch, and took the iron key from the brown envelope. The key slid into the lock of the iron ring, with the precision of an object made for that exact purpose. Turned. The hatch lifted. A wooden staircase descended into darkness from which rose air that was cool and clean, and that smelled of paint, of varnish, and of something Colette took 1 second to identify. It was the same faint smell of oil paint she had noticed when she first entered the house, but here at this opening, the smell was intense and vivid and unmistakable. She descended. At the bottom of the stairs, her hand found a switch on the stone wall. She clicked it. The light came on, and Colette saw. The cellar was roughly 25 feet long by 20 wide. The walls were native stone, like the house above, but here they were completely covered from knee-height to nearly the ceiling with paintings. Paintings of every size in simple wooden frames that Warren had made himself. As she would later learn, each one with a small paper label tacked to the lower right corner with a date and title written by hand. There were paintings on the long work table that ran down the center of the room, leaning against each other in vertical rows. Paintings hanging from wooden dowels that crossed the room overhead, suspended by monofilament where the light reached them. Paintings leaning against the walls in rows 2 and 3 deep. An entire shelf of rolled canvases neatly labeled awaiting future framing. And every painting, every single one without exception, was of Colette. She stopped on the second to last step with her hand still on the wooden railing. There was a young Colette in a blue dress laughing with her mouth open in a kitchen she recognized as Luetta's, where they had spent their first Christmas as a married couple. There was a middle-aged Colette Hare already streaked with white reading in the brown armchair that used to sit in the hallway of the Gaston Street townhouse and that Hollis had taken after the estate reading. There was a Colette sleeping in profile with the light of early morning on her face. There was a Colette from behind in the kitchen, with an apron on the handle of a wooden spoon pointing sideways like an antenna. There was a Colette in the garden of the apartment they had rented before Gaston Street, crouching beside a fern. There was a Colette at Luetta's funeral in black handkerchief in hand, her profile cut against the white July sky. There was a Colette, old, recent, very recent, sitting at the kitchen table on Gaston Street with reading glasses on her nose and the newspaper folded in her hand, with the morning light coming through the window and illuminating half her face. Colette recognized the angle. It was the kitchen window where the sun came in at 8:30 in the morning, at the exact angle of the chair where she always sat to drink her coffee and read the paper. Warren had observed her for decades and painted from memory. She descended the last step. She walked slowly among the paintings. She stopped before each one with enough time to receive what was in it, because there was a great deal. There was an entire lifetime of concentrated attention. The gaze of a man who had watched a woman with the patient intensity of someone who knows he is in the presence of something precious and wants to record every detail before time passes. And time passes. Time always passes. In the far corner of the cellar, a small writing desk of dark wood with a matching chair. On the desk, a jar of brushes, a water cup with residue on the rim, a sketch pad and a large envelope of heavy craft paper sealed with red wax. The kind of wax seal Warren used for important documents. Colette had seen it on the deed of purchase for the Gaston Street townhouse decades before. On the envelope written in the unmistakable hand, "My beloved Colette." Read, sitting down. There was a chair. She sat. She opened the envelope. 18 pages handwritten on heavy stationery in Warren's small and disciplined script that grew slightly larger in moments of emotion, a pattern she had learned to read over 46 years of notes and cards. The letter began, "My Colette, if you are reading this, it means that what I knew would happen has happened. And it means you are here in this cellar, seeing what I spent 30 years making. So let me start with this simple fact. I loved you so much that I needed to spend 30 years painting your face to contend with what I felt. It was not enough. It will never be enough." The letter told her everything. Why he had bought the cabin in 1989, because Hollis was already 18 and already showing who he would become, calculating and generous only when there was something to gain. Because Nolan at 16 was learning to do whatever was convenient. Because Rosalind at 14 was affectionate but weak in the most dangerous way, the kind that yields to whoever presses hardest. I loved them. They were my children. But I saw them, and I saw you. I saw you washing their clothes, going to their school meetings, staying up when they were sick, never receiving a thank you that was said with eyes meeting yours. I should have talked to you more about this. I should have confronted the three of them. I didn't, because there was peace in the house, and I feared that confronting them would break the peace. That was my cowardice. I ask forgiveness for that cowardice. Why the unanimity clause? Because Hollis and Nolan had not agreed on the time of day in 15 years, and the fight over the Pooler lot had gone to court. They would inherit the townhouse and be unable to do anything with it for years, perhaps a decade, while they fought and hired attorneys and built resentment. Not punishment, natural consequence of who they are. Why the cabin was the real inheritance, 14 acres, 6 of them, in protected hardwood forest eligible for conservation easements worth at current valuation, a sum that Beckett Trower would explain better than Warren could. 3 acres of cleared meadow with a spring that had never gone dry in 32 years. The spring had been assessed by a hydrogeologist Warren hired. In 2019, the report was in a blue folder in the desk drawer where she was sitting and had flow sufficient for commercial use. The parcel where the house sat was in an area the county was targeting for cultural tourism development. Dot would explain the details better than Warren could because she followed the local politics. Conservative estimate of land and house value $2.1 million. Could be more depending on what Colette chose to do with the property. The painting's 218 works had been formally appraised by Beckett Trower in 2020. The valuation report was in the same blue folder. Estimated total value with reserve pricing for the most significant works and market pricing for the remainder $3.8 million. 3 collectors had already been identified by Trower with documented interest in specific works. Not obligatory sales. Sell them when and if you want at the price you consider fair. But Colette, you don't need to sell anything. You don't need to do anything you don't want to do. The cabin produces. The spring has value. The pension you'll receive is enough to live comfortably here where the cost of living is low. I did the math many times. You are safe. Finally. Completely safe. That was the only thought that gave me peace when I imagined leaving before you. And then the passage that made Colette's hands go still on the paper. I did not paint you because you are beautiful though you are. I painted you because you have the rarest quality that exists in a human face. Truth. Every expression of yours is exactly what it is. When you smile, it is a smile. When you are sad, it is sadness. There is no performance. There is no mask. 30 years and 218 paintings, and each one is different because you are always yourself in every moment. And this being always yourself is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen. The letter ended. Thank you for 46 years. Thank you for staying. Thank you for taking 3 children without blinking. Thank you for your patience with my absences. Thank you for reading the same books I read. Thank you for saying bring them home on that rainy night in 1975. Thank you for every supper. Thank you for every night. The cellar has a window that opens to the back of the property. When you can open it, there is a dogwood tree outside that blooms white in April. You arrived in January, but the dogwood will bloom. I knew it would because you always chose the cold months for the important changes. I watched you long enough to know. The dogwood is for you, with all the love a person can fit inside. Warren. Colette read the letter once without stopping, then read it again slower, going back to the passages that needed rereading. Then she sat in the chair at Warren's desk with the 18 pages in her lap and looked at the paintings around her, the 218 versions of herself that a man had spent 30 years creating in silence and love and patience. And she wept. Not the kind of weeping that makes noise. The kind that comes from a place very deep and very old that has carried weight too long and finally can let go. Tears that fell without hurry, without urgency, without audience. She did not try to stop them. She did not raise her hands to her face. She let them come. There was a right to weep like this. There was a need to weep like this. And she did it in peace in the cellar that smelled of oil paint and of love stored away. After a time she could not measure, she walked to the window Warren had mentioned at the end of the letter. A small window set in the stone wall at a height that required her to lean slightly to reach the latch. She opened it. The night outside was clear with a full moon low on the horizon that lit the meadow in silver. And there stood the dogwood, a tree of perhaps 20 feet solitary in the center of the clearing. Its bare winter branches reaching upward in the moonlight, like the arms of something patient, something that knew what was coming and was in no hurry. It was not blooming, not yet. January was too early. But the buds were there. She could see them in the moonlight, small and tight along every branch holding their cargo of white petals, the way a promise holds its future. Thank you, she said, to Warren, or to the tree, or to the January night, or to all the 30 years of monthly trips she had not understood but now understood completely. Thank you for all of this. She stood at the window until the moon climbed high enough to disappear from the frame. Then she climbed the cellar stairs back to the kitchen, made coffee in the aluminum percolator Warren had left in the cabinet, and carried it to the ladderback chair in the front room, where she sat with the mug warming both hands and the silence of the house settling around her like something that had weight and kindness. Until the coffee cooled and her eyes closed, and she slept briefly lightly without dreams in the chair, where no one had sat but Warren for 30 years. The iron key lay on the kitchen table where she had set it down, still tied with its red twine catching the low light of the single bulb overhead. It had opened the cellar. It had opened everything. And now it lay there quiet, finished with its first purpose, waiting the way Warren had waited, the way the dogwood was waiting for whatever would come next. Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge the way spring arrives in mountains, not all at once but in stages, each one a small announcement. First the redbuds along the roadside, their purple-pink branches appearing overnight like brushstrokes someone added while Colette slept. Then the trillium on the forest floor, white and deliberate, pushing through the leaf litter with a patience that reminded her of Warren. Then the rhododendrons along the drive, filling out leaf by leaf, until the tunnel that had been bare branches in January became a green corridor that filtered the light into something softer. Colette learned the rhythms of the place, the way you learn the habits of a new person, with attention, with patience, with the understanding that it would take time. The mercantile on the main road in Brevard, run by a man named Collis Burnett, who had the memory of an archivist and knew by heart what every regular bought each week. The single daily bus to Greenville at 6 in the morning. The nearest neighbor's dot up the road Walt 2 miles below. And a young couple, Jensen and Maren Aldridge, who had bought a parcel adjacent to the cabin 2 years earlier and were building on weekends. She slept poorly the first nights, not from fear but from silence. The silence of the Blue Ridge at night was a different species than the silence of Savannah. It was a living silence full of sounds that were not urban noise, tree frogs. The creek at the bottom of the hollow, wind, moving through bare hardwoods occasionally, a barred owl calling from the ridge with a voice that sounded like a question no one had answered. Colette learned these sounds the way you learn the vocabulary of a language you intend to stay in. And after 2 weeks, the silence had stopped being absence and become presence. Beckett Trower arrived in the second week of March. He was a man of perhaps 60, well-dressed, without affectation, tortoiseshell glasses, the kind of deliberate walk that comes from decades spent in galleries. He brought an assistant, a young woman named Ivy, early 30s. Close-cropped hair, a notebook in which he wrote everything with a speed that bordered on shorthand, and a folder of documents they spent the entire afternoon reviewing at the kitchen table. "Mrs. Avara," Beckett said after sipping the coffee Colette had made, and which he received with the respect of someone who appreciates coffee properly brewed. "Warren was one of the most intelligent people I've known in my life, and I know a great many intelligent people. What he built in that cellar over 30 years is extraordinary not merely in quantity, but in technical evolution, the last decade especially. There are paintings down there that I submitted for independent evaluation to 2 critics without naming the artist, and both said the same thing, self-taught, with uncommon mastery of light and composition, with an obsessive subject that functions as the cohesion of the entire body of work." Obsessive. Colette repeated with a smile that held both meanings of the word. Obsessive in the most beautiful sense of the term. Beckett pushed a sheet of paper across the table. "I have documented interest from a collector in Asheville who wants 20 works from the most recent period as a group. He calls it the Late Colette Series, with your pardon, and says it is the finest portrait work of aging femininity he has seen in contemporary American art." He tapped the figure at the bottom of the page. "That is his offer. $840,000 for the 20 works of the final phase." Colette looked at the number. She looked at it long enough that Beckett said gently, "There is no rush. There is absolutely no rush to decide anything." "I know," Colette said. "I'm just getting used to the numbers. The total collection at the valuations I have could reach 3.8 million if sold strategically over 2 to 3 years. But again, no rush. Warren built this so you would have options, not obligations." Options? Colette turned the word over in her mind for days after Beckett left. April came and the dogwood bloomed. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Colette opened the kitchen window the way she did every morning. Coffee in hand, first light on the meadow, and the tree had changed overnight. The tight buds she had watched through January and February and March had opened into white bracts that caught the early sun and held it 4 petals per flower. Hundreds of flowers. The entire crown transformed into something that looked less like a tree and more like a declaration. She stood at the window for a long time. The coffee went cold in her hands. She did not notice. "You knew," she said quietly. "Not to the tree. To the man who had planted it or chosen this house because it was here, or both, she would never know which. You knew I'd be standing here when it opened." The weeks that followed were weeks of small construction. Jensen and Maren came on a Saturday in May with borrowed tools to fix a shutter hinge that had given way in the spring rains, and stayed for lunch. And lunch became a long afternoon that covered architecture, their new house, the history of Brevard, and eventually, inevitably, the cellar. Colette showed them the cellar that afternoon. She went down, first turned on the light, and stood back to watch their faces when they reached the bottom step and saw. Maren, who had studied interior design in Charlotte, was silent for nearly a full minute. Then she said, "Oh my God." Then she was silent again. Jensen, an engineer by training, walked among the paintings with his hands clasped behind his back, tilting his head to see from different angles. This man was extraordinary. Every painting is a different hour of the day. Look at the light in this one that's late afternoon. That one is early morning. He was studying the light. He studied everything, Colette said. It was Marin who the following week said to Colette, with an attempt at delicacy but a preference for directness, "Mrs. Avery, have you thought about what you're going to do with this place? Because I wake up every day thinking about it since I saw that cellar. A collection like this here in this setting, it could be something extraordinary." Colette had thought about it. She thought about it every morning while she drank her coffee and looked at the dogwood. She thought about it during her afternoon walks along the creek trail. She thought about it while she read at night in the ladder-back chair, with the wool coat she had brought from Savannah draped over her shoulders. There was an idea that kept returning. It had not finished taking shape, but it was forming. The renovation began in July, funded partly from Colette's savings and partly from the sale of 23 individual works from earlier periods that Beckett had negotiated with collectors in Asheville and Atlanta, totaling $280,000. She kept the 20 late Colette paintings together untouched. Jensen coordinated the structural work. Maren designed the lighting for the cellar, a project that took weeks of testing because the light had to serve the stone and the canvases simultaneously. Light that doesn't assault the work but doesn't let the stone die either. She explained with a precision Colette found admirable. Dot organized the cleanup crews with the efficiency of a woman who had done community work all her life. Neighbors Colette barely knew appeared with shovels and wheelbarrows and the practical goodwill of people who understand that work done together is faster. The driveway was regraded and lined with local stone. Walt's brother-in-law was a mason and charged a price Colette knew was a favor. The garden at the entrance took shape under Colette's own hands. She had discovered in recent months an affinity with the soil she did not know she had. There was something of Virgil, her father, in the act of planting and waiting, and she recognized it with a nostalgia that warmed rather than stung. She planted native azaleas, mountain laurel, wild columbine, and a kitchen herb garden along the side of the house, rosemary, thyme, sage, mint, that smelled so good in the morning. She sometimes went out just to breathe it before returning to the coffee. The forged iron railing for the cellar stairs was made by a blacksmith in Brevard, who had learned the trade from his father and who worked with an attention to detail that Colette respected. The new lighting was installed in October, and when they turned it on for the first time, Colette, Dot, Marin, Jensen, and Beckett, who had driven up from Asheville, there was a silence of several seconds that was genuine admiration. The canvases lit by the system Marin had designed seemed to have a different depth, as if the light revealed something that had been there all along, but could not be seen before. Warren Beckett said in a low voice with the gravity of a professional confronting something that exceeds expectation, "This man had real talent." It was in that same month, October, that the Stepchildren arrived. Colette knew beforehand. Walt called to say a rented SUV with Georgia plates had been in town asking about the property on Locust Hollow Road. Dot heard from Collis at the Mercantile that 2 men and a woman had been asking questions. The small town operated with the efficiency of a community alarm system that required no technology. The 3 of them. Hollis drove a black Tahoe, the kind of vehicle Hollis rented, to demonstrate that he arrived well anywhere. Nolan in the passenger seat with his arm out the window. Rosalind in the back with the expression of someone not entirely convinced this was a good idea. Colette saw them coming through the front window. She had made coffee, strung the dark roast she bought from Dot's store, and there were 3 mugs on the table because she knew exactly how many there would be. She had also placed, without conscious premeditation, but with the instinctive clarity of a woman who understands her own gestures, a jar of wild columbine she had picked from the garden that morning. The room said without needing words, "Someone lives here. This house has a keeper." They entered with the hesitation of people who had expected something else and did not know how to behave now that the expectation had not been confirmed. The front room was clean and bright with natural light from both windows open, the rug in place, the coffee, the mugs, a plate of Dot's shortbread. "You look well," Rosalind said, sitting down. The observation held something genuine. Rosalind was like that there was always something genuine in her, buried beneath the layers of convenience. "I'm very well," Colette said, pouring the coffee. "I have never been better." Nolan, who lacked Hollis's disguise and Rosalind's warmth, went straight to it. "Colette, we came because there are some things that need to be discussed about the estate, about what Dad left." "Everything is settled," Colette said. "The probate is underway with Miss Kellner." "Yes, but there are questions about the will that should be discussed as a family," Hollis said in the attorney's tone that was who he was, the tone that turned every subject into procedure. "There's an appraisal of the property filed with the court that may not reflect actual value." Colette set her mug on the table softly. "The cabin was appraised at $98,000 for probate purposes. Do you agree with that number?" Hollis and Nolan looked at each other. The same fraction of a second glance from the attorney's office in Savannah, but with different content this time. They knew something. They had discovered something. "There are indications," Hollis said carefully, "that the property may have additional characteristics that were not adequately considered in the original appraisal." "Additional characteristics," Colette repeated without emotion. "What kind of characteristics? An art collection, for example?" Nolan said without his brother's caution. "We've heard Dad painted. That there are paintings." "Heard from whom?" "That doesn't matter. It matters to me." Silence. Rosalind turned a piece of shortbread in her fingers without eating. "Colette," Hollis said, shifting into the voice of a man offering something, "we understand the situation has been difficult. The will is the will, and we respect that. But if there is a collection here that has value, that collection is family property. It's not solely yours." Colette looked at him for a long and tranquil moment. "Hollis, I am going to tell you something your father wrote for me that you need to hear." She did not raise her voice. It was the voice of always, but there was something in it that made the three of them go still with the immobility Colette had seen in animals in the presence of something they cannot classify. "He wrote that he left me the cabin with all belongings therein and anything the property may contain that is not visible to the naked eye. That phrase is in the will registered with the court. You already have an attorney. Your attorney has already read the will. You know what that phrase means." She continued still with the same quiet voice. "And you know what the unanimity clause means for the townhouse. You are here because you need money. You cannot sell the townhouse because you cannot agree. The investments are frozen for the same reason. You came here to see if there was something I would yield, something I would share, something I would give up." She looked at each of the three. At Hollis, who had said, "Watch out for the copperheads" on the sidewalk outside the attorney's office. At Nolan, who had offered $50,000 to take the burden off her hands. At Rosalind, who had said the townhouse was awfully big for one person. "I raised each of you, I washed your clothes, I cooked your meals, I went to your school conferences, I stayed up when you were sick. Not because I was legally required to, because you were children who needed someone, and I was there. I never asked for a thank you. I never needed a thank you. But I needed once to be seen as a person, not as the housekeeper, not as the intruder in the family, not as a problem to manage." She breathed. "That didn't happen. All right, I learned to live without it." "Colette, Rosalind began. "You don't need to say anything," Colette said with a gentleness that was genuine. "You really don't. I'm not angry. I'm at peace. I'm well. I'm better than I have been in a very long time. She stood a gesture that ended the visit with absolute clarity but without hostility. Have more coffee if you'd like. The road back has some rough patches after Greenville. Leave before dark. Hollis looked at her for a moment in which several things crossed his face in rapid sequence: calculation, recognition, something that might have been shame or might have been frustration, and it was difficult to distinguish. And then he stood. Nolan followed without another word. Rosaline stayed 1 second longer, as though she wanted to say something. Colette looked at her with an openness that said, "You can if you want." But Rosaline did not find the words, and she left too. Colette stood in the doorway watching the black Tahoe descend the gravel road, raising a fine dust that the afternoon breeze carried across the meadow. She watched until the vehicle disappeared around the bend. Then she went to the kitchen, washed the 3 mugs, and stood at the window looking out at the dogwood. Its white blossoms had faded weeks ago, replaced by the deep green leaves of summer. But the shape was there, the same patient shape it had always been. There was a lightness in her chest she had not expected to feel. There was peace. Not the empty silence of someone who has lost and accepted, but the full silence of someone who has put things in their proper place and can now look forward without anything pulling her back. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in early November, Rosalind's car appeared on the gravel road. No warning, no phone call. She stood at the gate alone, holding a small box. Inside the box was an old photograph, Colette holding Rosalind at age 4, sitting on the porch of the Habersham Street apartment, singing to her. Rosalind was looking up at Colette's face with the expression of a child who believes the person holding her is the entire world. "I found it in a drawer," Rosalind said. Her eyes were red. "I don't remember the day, but I remember the song." Colette looked at the photograph for a long time. She remembered the day perfectly. It had been a Thursday in October. Rosalind had a fever and would not stop crying. Colette had carried her to the porch because the evening air was cool and had sung the shape-note hymn Luetta used to sing while sweeping. Rosalind had fallen asleep before the second verse. "Come in," Colette said. "I just made coffee." The inauguration of the Avery cellar, the name Marin had suggested, and Colette had approved with a laugh, followed by a silence that said more took place on the first Saturday of December 2022, exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after Warren's death. Colette had not chosen the date for symmetry, but she recognized it when it arrived. More people came than she had expected. Beckett brought a group of collectors from Atlanta and Asheville, 11 people who spent the entire afternoon in the cellar, with the intensity of people doing something more than looking at art, doing archaeology of devotion. The county cultural affairs representative came with the chair of the tourism board. Walt and his wife, Dot Jensen, and Maren Collis from the Mercantile, the Brevard blacksmith, who had forged the stair railing and brought his wife and 2 children. The pastor from the Methodist church in town, a young man with glasses who had come one afternoon with a loaf of sourdough made by the church organist, and had stayed 2 hours talking about the books on the shelf Colette had begun assembling. And there were people Colette did not know who had heard about the place through channels she could not entirely track. A post Maren had made on a regional arts tourism page, a mention in a small circulation art quarterly that Beckett had arranged that mechanism of word of mouth that in small towns still moves faster than the internet. Colette spent most of the afternoon near the cellar stairs, receiving visitors, answering questions, accepting admiration with a grace that came not from training, but from genuine contentment. There was a moment near 5 o'clock when the light outside was turning gold and the movement inside was still strong, when she found herself alone for an instant in the corner of the front room and looked at what was around her. The stone walls she now knew in every detail, the flowers in the garden she had planted with her own hands, the rug in the center, the mugs on trays that Dot was supervising in the kitchen, the people circulating and talking, and some of them visibly moved. She thought, "I am home," not the Gaston Street townhouse that had been home for decades, but that also carried the weight of every small ceremony of erasure she had endured over the years. This place, these stones, this cellar that smelled of Warren and of love stored away. Here, on the wall beside the cellar stairs, in a spot she had chosen herself, the iron key hung on a small iron hook that the Brevard blacksmith had forged to match. The red twine was still tied to the ring-shaped bow. Beside the key, in a simple wooden frame, identical to the ones Warren had made for the paintings, the note from the brown envelope. When you're ready, the key opens the cellar. The cellar has everything. Everything. Colette, forgive the wait. Below the note, in a second frame, a small printed card with the words Marin had composed. And Colette had edited until it was exactly right, art made in love. Kept in silence. Found at the right time. On a morning in April of 2023, 15 months after she had arrived with a suitcase and $212 and a key she did not yet understand. Colette woke before dawn. She made coffee in the aluminum percolator. She opened the kitchen window. The dogwood had bloomed again. It stood in the center of the meadow, exactly as it had the previous April. Its crown covered in white bracts that caught the first light of morning, and held it with the stillness of something that knows it is being watched and does not mind. A few petals had already fallen, forming a thin white ring on the grass around the base of the trunk, and the breeze moved them gently, turning them over so they caught the light on one side and shadow on the other. Colette stood at the window with the warm mug in her hands. She was 72 years old. She had 14 acres of forested mountain land in one of the most beautiful hollows in western North Carolina. She had 218 paintings made by a man who had spent 30 years turning love into image, waiting for her to arrive and see. She had friends, real ones, the kind that come with soup when you need it, and stay to drink coffee when you don't. She had a garden where the wild columbine was opening its first blooms of the year. She had a spring that ran clear and cold year-round. She had a dogwood that would bloom every April like a promise kept. She had, for the first time in 72 years, a place that was completely hers. The woman the stepchildren had dismissed with a shack in the mountains and a joke about copperheads was standing at her kitchen window, with coffee warming her hands, and the April sun lighting the dogwood blossoms, and the iron key hanging on the wall behind her. Beside the painting Warren had painted Last Colette at the kitchen window, half her face in morning light, the other half in gentle shadow, looking out at something the viewer cannot see but that the painter clearly could. She smiled. The kind of smile that does not need an audience. It is never too late. For the love you did not know was being kept. For the home you did not know was waiting. For the woman who did not know she was free. For the life that can finally in fullness and peace begin. If Colette's story touched something in you tonight, I want to ask you a question before you go. Think about the person in your life who held everything together without anyone noticing. The one who cooked the meals and kept the calendar and stayed up when someone was sick and never asked for applause. Do they know you see them? Have you told them? Leave a comment and tell me who that person is for you. Subscribe if you haven't hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this with someone who needs to remember their own worth. Because together we prove that it is never too late.